speak to groups in our community about raising the minimum wage and about unions for service sector workers.
Well, I thought I knew what to expect. It wasn't my first rodeo, as they say. I am very fortunate to have a job that actually has in its title the term health and human rights. So that gives me a chance to go out and give talks like this. I've had a chance to give talks about expanding HIV/AIDS care in places like Kenya. I've had a chance to give talks about human rights and access to safe water for people in Haiti. I've had a chance to give talks, and I still give talks about access to medicines a lot, for people in places like South Africa. And when I went around our community and I talked to groups, sometimes it's Rotary clubs, sometimes it's school groups, sometimes it's church groups. When I gave that message, I was really heartened by the response. People responded compassionately. Sometimes people even responded with action to make things better. And then I began writing articles about workers in our community. And eventually I even wrote a book about low-wage workers in our community. And in that process, I started standing alongside folks in their efforts to gain a living wage, sometimes through building a union, sometimes through trying to raise minimum wage laws at the local or the national level. So I made the rounds of the community again. I started talking about the stories of dishwashers, of custodians, of security guards, home health aides. And what I expected was to hear the same kind of compassionate response I received when I talked about people in Kenya, or in Haiti, or in South Africa. But not so much. That McDonald's cashier, well, she wouldn't need more money if she didn't have a baby when she wasn't married. Well, that security guard's not being paid enough. Why doesn't he just go back to school and improve his skills? That home health aide, well, why doesn't she just go to the food pantry? They take care of things like this. Well, you can imagine those reactions were disappointing. And they were also puzzling. But then I reflected on my own experience with low-wage workers in our community. And when I was honest with myself, I started to recognize that, well, I didn't always respond as well as I should either. For example, I was writing this book, writing articles, and a story that ended up being the opening section of the book was about a woman who was a hotel housekeeper. And she did back-breaking work. It's really difficult work. She made about $9 an hour, really struggling. When I interviewed her, I walked to her house from my house. Now, her house was nowhere near as nice as the one I'm privileged to live in. It was a half-double in rough shape. She was worried about being evicted. She'd been evicted before. But it was close to mine, geographically. And when I spoke with a cook who was trying to get more than 30 hours a week, trying to not get laid off in the summers so that he and his family could pull out of bankruptcy, I interviewed him on the very same university campus at IUPUI where I work. Now, his salary, his job was nowhere near as lucrative as mine, but we worked in the same space. These were my neighbors. These are my coworkers. And if I was honest with myself, I didn't like how that felt. I didn't like thinking about that inequality. And it's not a past tense situation. Where I work now, several times a week, I talk with a grandmother who cleans our building, including cleaning our bathrooms. She works by any measure harder than I do, but her salary is nowhere near as high as mine is. And I don't like thinking about that inequality. So when I reflected on those negative reactions that you'd receive when you talk about raising wages, and it's not just negative reactions I receive, certainly these workers received and represented these workers receive them all the time, I began to feel that maybe the lack of compassion and willingness to respond to the people struggling all around us, that's probably connected to the fact that they are, in fact, all around us. Right? Because if they're suffering in Kenya, if they're suffering in Haiti, and if they're suffering in South Africa, we don't feel as guilty about it as if they're suffering around us. And when we feel guilty, we make excuses for inequality. We make excuses for why I'm more fortunate, excuses for why I deserve a bigger piece of the pie. Or even probably more often, that guilt can just cause us to turn away. We can turn away from the harsh reality of our own homes. Because when it comes to income, to pay for food, to pay for shelter, to pay for health care, we live in one of the most unequal nations in the world. We live in one of the most unequal states in that nation. We live in one of the most unequal communities in that state. When you talk about the gap between the rich and the poor, it is the biggest we have seen since the Great Depression. And for us, that means that in our communities and our workplaces, this economic inequality, it's staring us all in the face. At least, it's staring us in the face until we turn away from it. Because it's easier to turn away. It's easier to turn away, it's easier to rationalize the inequality than to feel personally responsible to do something about it. But we're called to do better, right? This congregation has embraced the goal of creating the beloved community, that vision that was given such resonance by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Dr. King made it very clear what he thought about working people living in poverty. Way back in 1955, at the start of his career, he delivered a sermon. And he delivered a sermon on the biblical parable of Lazarus and Dives. And you may remember this parable. Dives was a rich man, and Lazarus was the beggar at his gates trying to survive on just crumbs from Dives' table. They both die. In the afterlife, Lazarus is now in Abraham's bosom, as the parable goes, and Dives is cast into eternal torment. And he begs, Father Abraham says, please send Lazarus down just to give me a drop of water to ease my suffering. And Father Abraham says no. Now, in his sermon, Dr. King repeated that parable, which was probably familiar to his audience. But then he said something that I think surprised them. He said that Dives wasn't wrong because he was rich and that Lazarus was poor. He says Dives was wrong because he thought it was okay that he was rich and Lazarus was poor. And I'm going to quote from the sermon from Dr. King just a minute here. Quote, Dives' greatest sin was that he accepted the inequalities of circumstance as being the proper conditions of life. Circumstances make it possible for some people to get an education while other people are denied the opportunity. Circumstances make some people rich, give them social prestige, while others are left gnawing on the crumbs of obscurity. Again, Dr. King speaking. Now, Dives' sin was not that he made this gulf between him and Lazarus. This gulf had come into being through accidents of circumstance. The sin of Dives was that he felt that the gulf which existed between him and Lazarus was a proper condition of life. Dives felt that this was the way things were meant to be. End quote. So what about me? What about us? What about when we do okay financially, but we work alongside people who are struggling to make ends meet? What about when we do okay financially, but we live alongside people who are struggling to make ends meet? Are we like Dives? Do we think that that is the way things were meant to be? Do we think it's okay to live in a community where some people live in mansions and others sleep in cars or under bridges? To put a finer point on it, do we think it's okay that we have an economy that has lost manufacturing jobs but has gained other jobs? Jobs in healthcare, jobs in service sectors, jobs in food service. Jobs that are now the best options for mothers and fathers trying to raise their families. Yet those jobs aren't considered to be important. Those jobs aren't considered to have enough dignity to deserve anything but sub-poverty wages. Is that just the way things are meant to be? Now, I don't believe you think this way. Some of you may remember I've had the chance to come to All Souls a few times before, and I've had the chance to talk about living wages before, and folks in this congregation, in this community, responded compassionately and generously. And of course, far beyond mere words, you walk the walk. As a congregation, you push for economic justice through your participation in IndyCan. You support homeless families. and you conduct countless other acts of outreach on behalf of economic justice. So I thank you for that. But for all of us, Labor Day is a day to remember that we still have this daily and present economic injustice all around us. And that means there's much more to do. We have brothers and sisters in our city who are pushing for living wages every day. They're doing so through service sector unions like Unite Here, which represents now 1,000 workers across Indiana, mostly central Indiana, mostly food service workers, and they've won good union contracts for them. People are pushing for living wages through a service sector union called SEIU, which represents janitors and security guards in our community, pushing for better pay. And folks are pushing for living wages through organizations like Jobs with Justice, which Ollie already mentioned shares the plate today, which just last month, Jobs with Justice and these service sector unions pushed through at our local city-county council the first ever guarantee that our local government workers be paid a living wage. And if the idea of making food service workers or health aid jobs or janitor jobs and making them living wage jobs, if that just seems impossible, we need just to remember and remind ourselves of some recent history. Because there was another era in our community where the good-paying jobs that were once there seemed to disappear. And those jobs were replaced by work that was considered to be less valuable, work with uncertain hours and bad conditions. And that was about a century ago. And that was when agricultural work, the gold standard of the time, farm work, was replaced by manufacturing jobs. And places like Indiana felt it as strong as any place in the country. And those manufacturing jobs, they were bad jobs. They were dangerous, they were low pay, they had very limited and unpredictable hours. At least they were bad jobs until the labor movement, until political advocacy, a lot of it faith-based advocacy, turned them into good jobs. Jobs with union contracts, jobs backed up by programs like minimum wage laws, unemployment insurance, etc. And now we're in a different era. Now we've lost those manufacturing jobs. There are way too many of them. And now that same process needs to repeat itself for the jobs that we do have. The food service worker jobs, the security guard jobs, the custodian jobs. So if on Labor Day weekend we feel that we haven't done enough to confront this daily economic injustice, this inequality around us, and I certainly count myself in that category of folks who feel like I haven't done enough, here's what our working brothers and sisters need us to do. They need us to get past our guilt. They need us to forgive ourselves for the times that we've turned away. They need us to forgive ourselves for the times that we made divest-like rationalizations, that this gap is just the way things were meant to be. They need us to stand in solidarity with them because they're down at the city-county council. They're on the picket line. They're conducting their rallies. If you'd like to take action, if you'd like to be a part of this, you can learn more about the many opportunities going on right in our community if you go to the Central Indiana Jobs with Justice, their website or their Facebook page. That can get you alerts about how you can take action and you can stand with those folks. Because when we stand in solidarity with those who aren't paid a living wage, when we overcome our guilt, when we overcome our temptation to rationalize our own good fortune, when we do that, we are standing in Dr. King's shoes. Because he didn't just preach sermons about not accepting inequality, about embracing economic justice. His last months of life were spent planning a Poor People's March on Washington, a Poor People's Campaign for good paying jobs. And of course he died. He was murdered in the town of Memphis, Tennessee. And the reason he was in Memphis, Tennessee is because he was there to lead a struggle for sanitation workers, for garbage collectors, to have a union and to have a decent wage. What Dr. King knew was that our working brothers and sisters, they're also our neighbors. Our working brothers and sisters are also our co-workers. He knew that they are our community. And he knew that we need to have a lot less inequality and a lot more economic justice before we can ever become that beloved community that we're all aiming for.